because that is one of the most dramatic moments between the apostles in the entire public ministry. When an apostle hits another apostle. We've got close with it before. We had Peter, particularly suspicious of the Iscariot. What is he up to? Why does he keep disappearing? And what's this bad atmosphere he creates so often? And of course, he's not the only one who feels that way. And Jude Thaddeus, from his words, makes it clear that he knows that Judas is not good. So why didn't this happen before? Well, it didn't happen before because whenever Peter was getting close to working out what Judas was up to, Jesus would distract him. He'd either say, don't judge somebody without evidence. And they never did have evidence. Jesus cast a veil between Judas Iscariot and the other 11. And he did this because, I think he says it somewhere, had they known what was going on, they would have probably murdered Judas Iscariot. And Jesus could not accept that. In fact, Jesus rebukes Peter at times because he wants to be violent against the enemies of Christ. But Jesus doesn't say, I can have no part with you if you take that attitude. Also notice that of himself, Jude Thaddeus says that he's a descendant of Goliath's slinger. And that, of course, is King David. So Jude Thaddeus is a descendant of Goliath's slinger. Thus, his father, Jude Thaddeus' father, Alphaeus, is a descendant of David. Thus, Jude Thaddeus' natural brother, Saint Joseph, the husband of the Blessed Virgin Mary, is a descendant of King David. Thus, Jesus is rightful King of Israel through his lineage from Saint Joseph. And this is a legal right Jesus has through Saint Joseph, his foster father, because he is the legal father of Jesus. The Blessed Virgin Mary is a physical descendant of King David, and thus Jesus has the right to be called King of the Jews by his biological descent from David through the Blessed Virgin Mary. Notice also that St. Jude Thaddeus calls Judas Iscariot a spineless debauchee. Well, never mind the spineless bit. The debauchee description is what matters here. It is described how Judas periodically goes off. Well, you can imagine why. It's to speak to the chief priests and Pharisees, sometimes merely to tell them the whereabouts of Jesus as he goes about different parts of Israel and Samaria. But also, it's to go and find a woman to be with. There's one scene where Jesus is waiting for Judas to come back, the Iscariot to come back. And the Iscariot comes back very late one night, nobody else is awake. Jesus has got up and just goes downstairs and waits for the Iscariot. And he confronts him with this kind of activity the Iscariot engages in. And you see the anguish in Jesus about sin, about this particular kind of sin. No doubt it's prostitutes that Judas is going with. And that explains also why he needs money. And it explains why St. John describes to us how he steals from the common fund. He's paying for women, as well as for other things, the things of this world that we might all want, clothes and so on. He doesn't take to the lifestyle of an apostle very well. He was in the temple, not a part of the power structure, but on the edges of the power structure. That's what originally attracted him to Jesus. Judas Iscariot wanted power. And Jesus, the miracle worker, he saw immediately this may be the Messiah. And he believed him to be the Messiah, but he wanted Jesus to be a worldly Messiah who would conquer the temple and then conquer the Romans, uniting Israel. And of course, Judas Iscariot will be one of the 12 princes of this new land. But Judas Iscariot starts noticing Jesus is not following the pattern that's expected, that many Jews expected. It isn't the sole model of Messiah that the Old Testament has by any means. There's this suffering servant model as well, but Judas didn't see that, and he wasn't interested in that. And so as Jesus fails to follow the pattern that Judas Iscariot expects of him, Judas becomes disillusioned. All this going around, sleeping out in barns, in the open, having little food, not being comfortable, being despised, being hunted. The Iscariot hates this, but he'll put up with it if it's going to produce the results. But when it's clear that it's no longer going to do so, then Judas no longer wants anything to do with it, and no longer really wants anything to do with Jesus. And there's another factor that comes in. The Iscariot begins to fear. Because if Jesus is not going to conquer the temple is going to conquer him and anyone who's associated with him. And that can mean death. Joseph, his cousin, was against Jesus' public ministry partly because he says, look, when I think it was Judas the Galilean rebelled, and that's mentioned in the New Testament, not only was Judas the Galilean killed by the Romans, crucified, but his entire family lost everything and they were persecuted as well. And that could happen to the family of Jesus, and that includes the cousins. So Judas Iscariot is at the point, not long before the Last Supper, where he realises, if I don't hand him over to the authorities, I'm not going to save my skin. It's not just the money now, but Judas wants money. And this is a means of getting money. But he also wants to save his skin. He needs to save his skin. And so, this is the way to do it. Not to see Jesus killed, but to see him arrested, put in prison, roughed up maybe if it has to be, but put in prison. And Judas, although the other 11 apostles may well be hunted down, but they're fools. That's their problem. Judas will A, be saved from that, but also B, he can become rich and influential in the temple because he will have been the one who delivered them from their major enemy. So I'm gleaning all this from my reading of the poem of the Man God. It's pretty explicit. That was what Judas was about. But of course you can't get this from the Gospels. There's not enough time to go into all this. The most important things are told to us in the Gospels. And this is not the most important thing, actually, by any means. But it's very interesting for us to know, very important for us to know, I think. And that's why Jesus gives us this in the 20th century. Judas is a villain. Judas Iscariot is a villain. And now we know why. And it doesn't mean he's excused by any means. He's not excused at all. He is the worst. He's the worst person who's ever lived until the Antichrist himself. He's worse than Mao, Stalin, and worse than Hitler. Worse than them all. Worse than them all put together. And if that offended anybody, I don't care about that. He is worse than the worst person you can think of. He's a true, as Jesus would say, son of Satan. But to go back. So with Jude Thaddeus calling him a reptile, not just therefore offended, by him saying that Jesus is insane. Not just, this is Jesus, and it's Judas Thaddeus' cousin, with whom he grew up, whom he's admired since a child, whom they all admired since a child. The only family division came when Jesus said he's basically got this public ministry, he's the Messiah. You don't treat the family member like that. You don't disparage a family member like that. So that's a natural response from a family member. And Judas Thaddeus is a family member. But more than that, this is disparaging my family member and the Christ. So all this, where I left off with my digression about Judas Iscariot, we've got Judas Iscariot left on the floor, having been knocked down by Judas Thaddeus. So I'll resume the narrative from there. Judas Iscariot stands up. He is livid, but does not react in the least. And what amazes me, no one reacts to the new gesture of Thaddeus. On the contrary, it is obvious that they all approve of it. Now, just going back to what Maria Valtorta said, Judas didn't react to Jesus. Sorry, to Judas Iscariot, to Judas Thaddeus knocking him down. It says here, he's livid, but he does not react in the least. And it said before, when Judas Thaddeus knocked the Iscariot down, she says, Judas Thaddeus is bending over the face of the coward who does not react. Why doesn't he react? Maria Valtorta says, as he's probably afraid that Thaddeus may be aware of his crime. What crime? I think you know. But the crime is that of betraying Jesus to the Pharisees and the priests. Okay. The apostles clearly approve of what Judas Thaddeus has done. That's because over 3 years they've seen Judas Iscariot get worse and worse, less and less respectful of the Master. Jesus is called the Master in this work an awful lot. And they've held back, sometimes with Jesus intervening to prevent things getting out of hand. But he's not in the room in this case. But all their pent-up feelings are channeled through Judas Thaddeus' actions. Hence they approve of it. Is that right to approve of it? No, it's not. Because the way of our Master is not to do that. But Maria Valtorta isn't giving us a moral lesson. She's describing what actually happened. So to continue the narrative. The room has just become calm again when Jesus comes in. He appears on the threshold of the little door through which his tall person can just pass. He sets foot on the small landing. And with his meek, sad smile, he says, opening his arms, "Peace be with you." His voice is tired, like that of one who is languishing physically and morally. He comes down. He caresses the fair-haired head of John, who's rushed towards him. He smiles at his cousin Judas, Thaddeus, as if he did not know anything. And he says to his other cousin, "Your mother asks you to be kind to Joseph. He asks the women after you and me a little while ago. I'm sorry I've not greeted him." So here, this is the Joseph that I was referring to earlier. Joseph, the estranged brother of Judas Thaddeus and Simon and James of Alphaeus, the sons of Mary Clopas. So it seems that this Joseph, though he's been hard-hearted for some time now, he's, as Jesus says, he asked the women after you and me a little while ago. So as Jesus said, he's sorry that he's not greeted him. You can see that when it says Jesus has come through into the room, and it seems that he doesn't know what's just happened. It says he does not know anything, or he greets his cousin Judas, smiles at him as if he does not know anything. And one might say, but Jesus is God, he knows everything. Well, actually, he doesn't know everything all the time. He has the capacity to know when he wants to know, but otherwise he is as a normal person, a human being, though he is a divine being with a human nature. We remember in the Gospels when the woman with the issue of blood touches his garment, he turns round and says, "Who touched me?" It was not a rhetorical question. He really didn't know who touched him. But had he engaged his divine nature, if I can put it that way, he could have known. But the routine was not to do that, because he's living as one of us on this earth. That's the purpose of the incarnation. So he comes down, he caresses the fair head of John, who has rushed towards him. He smiles at his cousin Judas, as if he did not know anything, and he says to his other cousin, "Your mother asks you to be kind to Joseph. He asked the women after you and me a little while ago. I'm sorry I've not greeted him. You will do it tomorrow." Jesus says, "Tomorrow? I shall always have time to see him." "Oh, Peter, we shall be together for a little while at last. Since yesterday you seem a will-o'-the-wisp. I see you, then I no longer see you. Today I can almost say that I lost you, and you too, Simon." Simon responds to Jesus, "Our hair, which is more white than dark, can assure you that we were not absent craving for flesh," says Simon gravely. Now, although at all ages it is possible to suffer from that hunger, the old worse than the young, says the Iscariot offensively. Simon looks at him and is about to reply. But Jesus also looks at him and says, "Have you a toothache? Your right cheek is swollen and red." And he's referring to Judas Iscariot there, not knowing about the blow that he's just suffered. Judas Iscariot responds, "Yes, it is aching, but it's not worth worrying about." The others do not say anything, and the matter dies away. Jesus asks, "Have you done everything that was to be done? You, Matthew, and you, Andrew, and you, Judas, have you seen to the offer for the temple?" Both the first two and the Iscariot say, "Everything you said was to be done today has been done. Do not worry. I took the early fruits of Lazarus to Johanna of Chuza for the children. They said to me, 'Those apples were better.' They had the savour of hunger, those ones. And they were your apples," says John, smiling and dreaming. Jesus also smiles at the recollection. That, by the way, is a reference to an episode a year or two earlier. And I'll mention it because there are some of you who may never read this work. In that episode, we have a person, a quite well-off man, who gives Jesus hospitality, and the apostles as well, I think. And this man owns fruit trees and so on, olive groves and all that kind of stuff. And that's great. He's a follower of Jesus. Jesus is coming back that way another time. And he sees two emaciated children, orphans. They've got no food. They're in a real mess. They need help. A boy and a girl, little boy and a little girl. And they say that a certain man whom they tried to get food from had chased them away and warned them that he'd harm them if they didn't clear off. Thieves, scoundrels, little beggars. So Jesus takes them and walks with them to this man's house, and it is the very man whom Jesus had assisted previously. And when the man comes out, I think first he sees the kids and he's about to tell them to get away, and they're scared. And then he sees Jesus and he lightens up and he welcomes them in, and I think is willing then to provide for the kids. But Jesus is not interested at this point. He chastises him for his complete selfishness and cold-heartedness towards these who Jesus regards as belonging to himself. They're his own, as all children are. Jesus' affection for children is laid out clearly in the Gospels, and we find clear instances of it in the Gospel according to me, the poem of the man God, from which I'm reading. And so this man is trying to be very, very apologetic to Jesus. But Jesus says, I blessed your property, I blessed your field, I blessed your crops. And he decides to withdraw the blessing. The man begs Jesus not to do this, because there's been an abundance of crops since Jesus had blessed them. But Jesus is having none of it. Effectively, Jesus tells him, you're going to have to do penance. You're going to have to do a long penance for what you've done. And those crops, I don't know whether they wither immediately in front of us. I don't think they do. But they do. They wither anyway over some period of time. And the man's entire fields are ruins. And the man is distraught, but he can do nothing about it. This might be a warning. We know of gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and he is mild, and he is meek. But he's not a different person from the Jesus of the book of Revelation, or the Jesus not yet incarnate on earth as he is in the Gospels, that is in the Old Testament, because the Holy Trinity is in the Old Testament, as it is in the book of Revelation. And so the Jesus who seems ferocious, a fierce, real Lion of Judah in the book of Revelation, is the same person who is wandering the roads of Palestine 2,000 years ago. Well, that's the recollection of Jesus when he smiles. And those two children are the ones who received the apples from Jesus. And they loved the apples, but they were hungry. That's why St. John says, they had the savour of hunger, those apples. That's what made them more tasty. Now they've received apples just now, they're not as good. And that's why they said those apples were better. Because St. John took these new apples to the kids. But what's this business about taking them to the kids at Johanna of Chusa? Well, these children are orphans, so they need a family. They can't go around with Jesus and the apostles all the time. They need parents. And so Jesus goes to Joanna of Chuza. Joanna of Chuza is Joanna, the wife of Chuza. Chuza, we know from the Gospels, is King Herod's chief steward. Very powerful man. But Joanna is childless. And like all Israelite women, not modern Western women, but all Israelite women, probably now, and at those times, I shouldn't say now actually, but traditional women now and all Israelite women back then, they wanted children. And not having children, not being able to have children was a sign of shame. It's not, no way is it a sign of shame now, because women and men are called to a life, sometimes a family life, but oftentimes not. But nonetheless, women who can't have children can be mothers to children who don't have mothers or fathers. And so Jesus goes to Joanna of Chuza's property, discusses the situation with her, and she's ecstatic. She wants to take these children in, and she does. And so then Jesus goes back and brings the children, because he didn't take them at first, because what if Joanna showed in her demeanour that she didn't want these children? They would pick up on it and they would feel rejected. And Jesus is the subtlest, kindest man. So he goes back and collects these children, and they're introduced to Joanna of Chuza. And I don't know if Chuza himself is there at the time, but they get to know her, and she becomes their mother, and Chuza becomes their father. And of course, they've gone from absolute degradation to children in a loving and rich family. So that's the story that's behind that smile of Jesus and the recollection and the reference of St. John to apples. It's the early fruits of Lazarus, those apples. This is Lazarus of St. John's Gospel, who is raised by Jesus from the dead. He's rich. He has orchards, olive groves, everything. And so this is where the fruit comes from. So I stopped the narrative to reminisce about that reminiscence. And so I'll now pick up the narrative from where it says, Jesus also smiles at the recollection. I've seen Nicodemus and Joseph, says Thomas. You've seen them? Did you speak to them? Asked the Iscariot with excessive interest. Yes, I did. What's strange about it? Joseph is a good customer of my father. So remember, St. Thomas he knows metallurgy. He knows about working gold and silver. So Nicodemus, also being a rich man, will get fine jewellery and other ornamentation from Thomas's father. So Thomas said, what's strange about it? Joseph is a good customer of my father. You never mentioned it before. That's why I was amazed. Judas tries to make up for the impression he'd given previously of his worry about Thomas's meeting with Joseph and Nicodemus. So there we get almost Judas Iscariot giving himself away. He's worried that he's going to get found out. He's betrayed Jesus already. He's just on the point of the final acts of the betrayal. But if he's found out, he's amongst what are now his own enemies. And so he's extremely scared and wants to make sure nobody's in the process of giving him away. And if Nicodemus and Joseph, who are members of the Sanhedrin, have spoken to Thomas, being members of the Sanhedrin, they may have become aware that Judas has communicated with members of the Sanhedrin to get Jesus arrested. And if Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, I should have mentioned that's Joseph of Arimathea, not Joseph, the son of Alphaeus, cousin of Jesus, not Joseph, the foster father of Jesus, but Joseph of Arimathea, if Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus learn about this plot that Judas is wrapped up in, and they tell Thomas, Thomas will tell the others, and Judas may not get out of there alive. Okay, to resume. Now Bartholomew is speaking after Judas has inquired of Thomas about Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. It seems strange to me that they've not come to venerate you. They did not. Neither did Chusa, nor Manaen. None of, but the Iscariot laughs sneeringly, interrupting Bartholomew, and he says, "The crocodile hides itself at the right moment." "What do you mean? What are you insinuating?" asks Simon, aggressively as never before. Just before I go on from there, I've mentioned who Chusa is. Manaen, who's he? Well, he's mentioned once, and that's in the Acts of the Apostles. As far as I'm aware, it's just that once. He's not a nobody, he's a big somebody. If I remember rightly, he is the half-brother of King Herod himself. So he's extremely powerful. He becomes a follower of Jesus very early on, and he wants to get away from Herod's court. He regards it as debauched, sinful, just decadent. But Jesus doesn't want him to become an apostle. And that shows Jesus has got a master plan. It's not just everybody who follows him becomes an apostle or a disciple who goes around with him. And it's not that Manaen will become a person who's going to overthrow Herod in any way or anything like that. There's nothing worldly about it. It's just that at that time Jesus sees that Manaen should stay where he is. He can do good where he is, and after Jesus leaves the earth, Manaen can do good in the way Jesus wants him to then. Jesus has everybody marked out with a mission. And it isn't always going to be blossoming during Jesus' earthly ministry. But in response to St. Bartholomew saying, well, you know, the powerful ones haven't come to venerate Jesus, well, that's the crocodile hiding itself because it's in danger. So they're not real followers of Jesus, they're crocodiles. And as I said, Simon the Zealot replied, "What do you mean? What are you insinuating?" And Simon's aggressive in his request with that question. And Jesus responds, "Peace, peace. What is the matter with you? It is Passover evening. We've never had such a worthy display for the consumption of the lamb. So let us consume the supper in the spirit of peace. I see that I've upset you considerably with my instructions of these last evenings. But see, I have finished. Now I will not upset you any more. Not everything has been said of what refers to me, but only the essential part. The rest you will understand later. You will be told, yes, there will come those who will tell you. There will come one who will tell you." And that is I consider a reference to the Holy Spirit, because in the text it has who with a capital W. Just to carry on with Jesus speaking. "John, go with Judas and somebody else to get the basins for the purification. And then let us sit at the table." Jesus is heart-rendingly kind. And then they begin what is briefly recorded in the Gospels, which includes the washing and so on. And in fact, I will not carry on reading that because this has been long enough already. But I'll say that I need at some point to do a video where I actually go through the sequence of the Last Supper, because it's divided up. It's, we can say, two broad parts: the Passover meal, the old rite, and the new rite, which is incorporated into our Holy Mass. But it would make this video extremely long, and I just wanted to give you something which you can't get from the Gospels. And so we'll stop the video there.